This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 189 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. Many people treat social skills groups as if they're the complete package, when in fact they're just one part of a bigger service plan. When we lesson plan, we can't think of our intervention as something that starts and ends with a 20-minute therapy session when it comes to social skills. Instead, we should think of it as a planning or a priming session. That's why one of the very first things I teach clinicians in the School of Clinical Leadership is how to utilize multiple service delivery models when supporting executive functioning, because social skills really falls under the umbrella of executive functioning. So that's why in this episode, I wanted to share 2 sneak peeks from the program. I will be sharing the audio from some video clips from the School of Clinical Leadership that will set the stage for effective social skills intervention and share how I think about it. So in this episode, you will learn how to use social skill building sessions in a way that builds resilience, situational awareness, and considers a student's neurodevelopmental differences. I hesitate to use the word social skills group because I know that using that word makes people assume different things. So typically my experience is that people think one thing or the other. One possible thing that they might think is, why are you doing social skills groups and just teaching kids to be neurotypical? And then on the other hand, there are people who might say, why are you doing social skills groups when you know that they result in really poor generalization? Well, what I am suggesting is not either of those things. So I will also be sharing why pre-made social narratives don't result in good generalization and how to be a good consumer of commercially available products. So this is something that I've asked about all the time. If I offer just things that you can just print and go and use in a 20-minute therapy session. When you do social skills intervention that way, you are not going to get good generalization. Again, when you think of the session as starting and ending with that lesson plan, it's not going to give you the best results. And you also run the risk of teaching students skills in a way that makes it kind of awkward for them and really doesn't take the context into account. And that's where you run the risk of simply just trying to teach kids to just follow a set of contrived rules rather than really reading a situation and thinking critically about it. I will also be sharing the 3 components of effective social skills intervention and where the social skills group fits. Again, shifting our thinking from saying this is a social skills group and I have 30 minutes on the student's IEP, so that's what the intervention is, versus thinking of it as an opportunity to meet with students, to strategize and plan with them. It's really a lot different and way more effective when we think of it that way, and it's going to impact how you plan for your sessions. And that's why this last point is so important. I will be sharing the components of good social narratives and how to create them on the fly. So when you actually know the components of strategies like social narratives or video modeling, you understand the structure. So what that allows you to do is, instead of being reliant on commercially available products, what you are relying on is a tool that you have that's essentially in your head. You know the framework. So what that allows you to do is take situations that students are experiencing and create a narrative or a script or a mantra for them that they can use to talk to themselves and kind of talk themselves through situations, and give them some retrieval strategies that they can use in order to take what you're teaching them in that planning session and apply to other situations. So what that allows you to do is be less reliant on lesson plans and more adaptable, so that it actually takes you less time to plan. When you learn these frameworks and they're things that you have and you're really solid with them, it can cut down on your planning time, and it can actually make you more effective if you think about just creating things on the fly and just looking at situations that students are encountering and using those to plan your sessions rather than thinking about commercially available products. Again, once you learn the framework and you learn to use effective interventions and you have those components in your head, what that allows you to do is look at those commercially available products and figure out when it might make sense to pull them in versus when they're not really going to be useful for your students. So, as I said, these audios that I'm going to share come from some of the videos that are in my School of Clinical Leadership program, which is my course that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. So I address direct intervention, such as the audio that I'm going to share today. And then I also show you how to build a strategic plan so that you can figure out how to train others in some of these strategies, because that's really going to be an essential component to ensuring that you get good generalization. To learn more about the School of Clinical Leadership, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. I am offering a $100 referral bonus. So if you are already a member of the program and you refer a friend, all you need to do is let them know that they can email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com and tell me that you referred them, and I will set you up with that bonus. Now, please enjoy this episode where I share how to set the stage for social skills lesson plans and interventions. And then I share some tutorials about how to use social narratives and video modeling. Today, I wanted to give a little context for how we want to think about social skills intervention or social skills curriculum. I have a lot of people come to me and they say, Karen, can you provide me with a set of scripts or a curriculum, or I just want materials I can print out so I can do print and go and plan my therapy sessions really quickly. And they want everything kind of laid out in a hierarchy, sequenced for them. And I totally get it. You have a lot on your plate. And the idea of a curriculum, whether it's for language therapy or whether it's for social skills, seems very enticing. But I promise you that is not going to save you time, and it is not going to serve you or your students. So one of the reasons why that's the case is because there is no curriculum that exists that would meet all of your students' needs when it comes to social executive functioning, because each individual student, whatever is going on with them, is so specific that there's no way I could create a bunch of social scripts that would be relevant to them in language that would be something you could use. You would spend so much time adapting things that you would just be rewriting all of them yourself. So it doesn't make sense for me to do that. It wouldn't be a good use of my time because I'd never be able to accommodate all the different scenarios. And it wouldn't be a good use of your time or your students' time to be using those materials. It would actually create more work for you in the long run as well, because your students would stay on your caseload longer, they'd be struggling, and it wouldn't really serve anyone. So that's why I operate from frameworks that allow you to have a decision-making process. And yes, I do give you tools.
I narrow it as much as possible so that you have a system, you have tools that allow you to create your operating procedures and your frameworks so that it doesn't take you hours and hours. You're not starting from scratch for every single kid, but you have some wiggle room in there for your own clinical problem solving. When we think about social skills specifically, and I'm going to use social narratives, social stories, which if you're talking about the trademarked term by Carol Gray. So I'm going to talk about that tool because it's a common one that people know about as it pertains to social skills and just some of the misconceptions about how to use this tool and just how we handle social skills groups. So you may have heard people saying things like social skills groups don't work, or social skills training is ableist, there's no generalization, and all of those things are true to some extent. But that doesn't mean that we can't work with students individually or in small groups on social executive functioning, but we have to do it in the right context. So when we think about social skills intervention, you want to make sure that you have the 3 different areas of your service delivery. And when we think about social skills and preparing students for those unstructured situations, we want to think about it in the context of 3 things: front loading, real life practice, and that review and evaluation. So things like front loading would be, how do you prepare students ahead of time for those situations? Then obviously, once you've prepared them, and this could be, you can do some of this front loading in your therapy sessions. You could train other people like parents or teachers or other people who are interacting with your kids outside of therapy sessions. You can train them to front load, but then the child has to go have that experience. Sometimes during that experience, there might be someone providing some modeling or prompting or supporting, but the student has to have enough space to apply those skills in a real life setting. So they have the experience, and then you can reflect. So again, somebody who is right there with the student can do that process with them right then and there. Or that can be something that you do in a therapy session as well. You can reflect on something that happened in the real world. So that is how we might want to think about this. An example would be, let's say you have a student who is having a difficult time in the lunchroom. So you could front load in your therapy session, and then you could also train a teaching assistant to do some front loading before the student goes to lunch. Then they're going to go to lunch, have their experience. In that context, it wouldn't make sense for an adult to be hovering over the student in most cases. So they've got to kind of hang back, let the student handle the situation. And then maybe after lunch, maybe whoever that adult is could have a quick debrief with a student, and you could also have a debrief with that student in your therapy session. So that is one example of how that process can look at a high level. The difference between this and what a lot of people do is that they think of the social skills curriculum or the therapy session as the be-all, end-all standalone, and they don't necessarily have those other parts. And that doesn't allow the student to apply the skills and draw those connections. So students need to have tools that they can use in order to be supported in those situations. And that's what the front loading is for. It helps them to practice and prepare in a situation that is more structured, that has less anxiety. But in order for them to get better, they have to go experience it. So when we're thinking of something like a social narrative, all that is a front-loading tool. It's not the only front-loading tool. You could simply have a conversation with the student, but a social narrative is a structured, common technique that we know, that's been researched, that can allow you to front-load. So it's just one tool in your toolbox. But the main thing is that the social narrative isn't the intervention. It is one piece of the intervention that happens in one component, which is the front-loading component. And yes, sometimes we can use other tools in the reevaluation. You can sometimes use a social narrative in the reflection and evaluation part of intervention as well. But the main thing is that we don't want to think of social executive functioning intervention as, this is my lesson plan, this is what I'm doing in therapy. We want to think about those lesson plans, those tools, those published curriculums as things that we can pull in as they're relevant to our students. We don't even really need those things. You can use them if you want to. If you have good problem-solving skills and you know how to pull them in as they're relevant, it's fine to do those things, but you don't want to use that as your guide. You want to use your high-level framework and your personal operating procedures that you've developed based on the research and based on the way that services work in your building in the context of what's appropriate for your students. That's what should be guiding your intervention. And you pull in those curriculums and those published materials as recommended or as needed. That's how we avoid being ableist, teaching students to be awkward and rote in social situations, or just not generalizing and continuing to struggle. So that's how we want to think about those situations, those strategies. We want to think about them as front-loading tools, things that students can pull out of their toolbox in those social situations, as well as things for self-evaluation. Because what that helps you do is use it in the right way and make sure that it's customized for your student. So think about that as you go through this training, as you go through all of the advanced intervention tutorials. Again, this is not something that is a scripted, here's everything printed out for me, what I do in therapy. This is something that you are going to use in the bigger picture framework for your executive functioning programming that you're developing.
Next, I will share the tutorial. So we'll start with the social narrative videos. A couple things to note. Please bear with me with the change in audio. These videos were all recorded at different times when I had different devices, so you will notice a slight difference there. And also, I wanted to mention that I have updated my terminology that I use and the way that I phrase things since originally recording some of these videos. The strategies still work. It's just that I've updated how I explain things in terms of deficits versus learning needs and support needs. And I give context and explain that within the program before any of the videos. So we'll start with the social narrative video, and then after that, you will be able to hear the video modeling tutorial.
Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen. In this video, we're going to talk through how to utilize social narratives and social scripts. So we'll talk about the essentials and that big picture as far as the entire process that you need to utilize in order to ensure your students learn the appropriate skills and generalize them. So I'm not going to go as in depth as I did with the video modeling video because the process is exactly the same. The only difference is that you'll be using a narrative or a script in the rehearsal portion of the process instead of actually using the video. And yes, there might be certain times where you might utilize both at the same time. Maybe you alternate days, or maybe you even do the video and then you do the script. So there's a number of different ways you can do this, but the process is very similar. So before we get going on that process, I wanted to clear up a common point of confusion with this strategy. So the difference between a social script versus a social story versus a social narrative. So social stories are a term that was designed by Carol Gray, and it's actually a trademarked term. So you are only actually doing a social story if you are using her unique proprietary process, and it's actually a copyright violation. So for example, people who are on Teachers Pay Teachers who are saying, you know, social story scripts, or here's some social stories, those are actually not social stories, and that's actually a violation because it's a trademarked process that was designed by Carol Gray. So if you're not actually using the framework that she outlines, and if you're not actually affiliated with that company, you actually shouldn't be saying this is a social story, like if you're selling a product or something like that. And if you're not actually using the exact sentence types that she outlines, you're technically not doing a social story. So the difference between a social story and a social narrative is basically that a social narrative is kind of like the generic term. So it's almost the difference between iPod and MP3 player. That being said, it doesn't really matter. Social narratives are just as effective. It's just that they are not the official copyrighted trademarked term. So yes, if you want to stay true to social stories, you do have to make sure that you're using that process, but it isn't necessary for you to do in order for you to be effective. So what I am going to do in a later video when we talk about social scripts is pull out the essentials that you need in order for it to actually work. It won't be whatever you design. You probably just want to call it a script or a social narrative, but it's really kind of a semantics issue. But I wanted to just clear that up because there are trainings you can do to get trained in that social story process if you want to be true to, the proprietary process, but it's not necessarily for you to be effective. Now, a social script is just another strategy. So while a narrative is in the story format, a script might just be kind of like a mantra or something that you say in order for the student to remember to do a certain behavior. So again, they're very similar. They can all be used to effectively teach students certain social behaviors, but you want to just make sure that you aren't using the terms incorrectly. So let's talk a little bit about that process. So what you actually need, you can see that this process is very similar to what I outlined for video modeling. We obviously want to do steps 1 and 2, which is to identify the correct area of social impairment and the correct target behavior or behaviors that you want to utilize. Sometimes you might have multiple stories for multiple behaviors because you don't want to be focusing on too many things at once. You might want to just focus on one thing at a time and then layer on the other behavior later. There might be more than one target behavior associated with one area of social impairment that you're working on, but you want to be aware of this because it can be really helpful in troubleshooting when a student isn't doing what you want them to do. Sometimes it might be, hey, we've got the correct area of social impairment, but we're not really picking the right target behavior to make this super functional. Or it might be something like, okay, they've got this behavior down, but there are still these other things that are getting in the way, and we're going to need to layer it on. Or maybe you might have a behavior that you're working on, and the way that you're explaining it doesn't quite link up to the area of social impairment. So you want to make sure that you're always aware of this. Same thing with distinguishing between a skill and performance deficit. That can impact the way that you're actually utilizing this whole process, as far as maybe with a skill-based deficit, you're putting more emphasis on the rehearsal, and then for a performance deficit, you'd be emphasizing the practice component more. But you just want to always be aware of these things. And again, I talked a little bit about the difference between using a script or a story or a video to show a student how to do a certain skill-based area versus trying to improve a performance deficit. I talked a little bit about that in the video modeling essentials video. So if you haven't watched that, you're going to want to make sure that you go back and watch that as well. So really the only difference here between what I outlined for video modeling and for this one is that number 3 is that you're going to create a story or a script instead of a video. All the other areas are going to be the same. You're going to want to make sure that you utilize a rehearsal schedule and a practice schedule to make sure that they are learning the skill, but also have opportunities to actually practice it at the appropriate times. And then you're also going to want to make sure that you assign people to certain tasks so that you make sure that they get done, so that there's no confusion about who is responsible for what, and so that you're working together as a team. Now, I will talk about as far as the tech and actually creating the story. Again, that is just, as you can see, just one part of the process, the actual script and story itself. So that's why I focus on the high level process more so than getting that story or script perfect. I promise you will still, if you understand this process and you're good at working through it, you will be just as effective, even, or maybe even more effective as you would be if you spent a ton of time feeling stressed about getting the story or script perfect, because it is just one part of that process. But Obviously, you still need to know how to do it right, and you need to know how to do it efficiently, so we will talk about that in a later video. But for now, we're going to wrap this up, but this is the process that you'll want to utilize in order to implement the strategy of using social narratives and social scripts, or if you're being official, social stories.
And here is the final tutorial on video modeling.
Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and in this video I'm going to go through the essentials for video modeling. So with video modeling, what we are doing is we are showing students a video of an appropriate social behavior. The purpose of this is to explicitly teach certain social skills or certain behaviors that a student is going to need to do in a given situation that maybe they aren't picking up on through just implicit learning from being in that situation. So we're taking that implicit learning and instead we're going to be doing explicit learning so that our students can actually cue into the necessary things. So before we actually get into how to create a video, I'm going to be going into some things as far as the tech in one of the later videos, as far as how you can do this quickly. But before we do that, we need to know the high level steps and the necessary ingredients, if you will, to knowing how to implement this strategy. Now, I've had a lot of people say to me, you know, I wish I had a place to go where I could have pre-made scripts or videos. And the problem with that is that each individual is so specific. So there might be some really random, unique situation that your student is struggling with. And if you resort to using those generic videos, yes, they can be useful some of the time for a lot of the behaviors that we might expect that are common things that students struggle with, but there are a lot of situations that are going to be unique to that student that you wouldn't think of, you know, you might not think to have that video pre-made. So we do end up making things up on the fly and making things that are student specific. But the way that we actually do that efficiently and do that in a way that doesn't take a ton of time is to be really familiar with the process. Now, when you first start doing this, it might take a little bit longer, but as you get familiar with the process, you're going to be able to knock it out much more quickly. So really what I want to give you are the skill sets behind knowing how to implement this strategy rather than just giving you a bunch of pre-made videos. Because number one, you're not going to have a video. There's no way that I would be able to come up with a video that would meet all the different needs of all the students that you're going to work with over the years. And number two, if you don't know how to implement the high level steps of the strategy, it's probably not going to work anyways. So with that, I wanted to get into the essentials of what you actually need to do when you are implementing video modeling. Now, video is great because it does tend to be more engaging. Kids can attend to it easily. It is a little bit easier for them to give their undivided attention to a video. And what we're going to be doing within the video is just actually demonstrating the target behavior. And we are also going to be giving some other explicit explanations. So we might even be narrating in the video, using specific scripts within the video, or we might be doing that before and after the video while we're debriefing with our students. So the steps that you actually need to take in order to implement this strategy effectively is number one, you need to make sure that you identify the correct area of social impairment and associated target behaviors. So in other words, we need to know what's wrong and we need to know what behavior we want to replace in place of those behaviors that might be inappropriate or that we're not seeing in order to be able to pick the appropriate video and design the appropriate video. So a perfect example of this is eye contact. A lot of people focus on that goal. A lot of people are worried about that and have a goal about it. So they might try to make a video about like, I look at you when I talk to you, or something like that. And we are going towards explaining that behavior. But the problem with that is that we might not be linking that up to the correct area of social impairment, because usually if a student is struggling with eye contact, they're struggling with all nonverbal communication behaviors just overall. And so we want to make sure that we're really looking into that deficit area. So we're picking the one that is the highest priority, and then also figuring out exactly why the student is doing what we think they should be doing, so that we're explaining the right things to them and we're really explaining the meaning behind that behavior. So we want to figure out what's impaired, and then we want to figure out what are the target behaviors as a result. Another thing with eye contact, as an example, sometimes not making eye contact has to do with not being able to initiate interactions, which is a different skill than nonverbal communication. So they go hand in hand, but it's a different skill set. So if social initiation is the behavior that is the deficit area, then our video is going to be totally different, because it's going to be all about getting the attention of somebody that we want to talk to and starting a conversation. So the target behavior might be different based on what the area of social impairment is. So you're not going to be able to pick an appropriate video if you don't know what that is. So always make sure that you have an idea of what this is. Even if you're not sure, it's okay to make your best, I don't want to say guess, but pick the area that you think it is based on the information that you have, and try the video intervention, and then you might need to go back and do some trial and error. The second thing we want to make sure that we do is distinguish between a skill and performance deficit. Now, in my previous video, I did talk about how video modeling is a good way to remediate skill deficits, because a lot of times students might not be engaging in appropriate behaviors because they don't have the knowledge of the behavior and the awareness of when they should actually be doing it, and they literally do not know how and when to do that behavior. So the video modeling is a good way to explain some of those things to your student in a safe situation. Now, the reason that we need to distinguish between skill and performance is because obviously, if it's strictly a skill deficit, or if you think for sure there's a skill deficit, you're going to need to make sure that you spend enough time in that safe setting reviewing the video. It could change your rehearsal schedule of how often you have the student watch that video. Now, if you think it's more of a performance deficit, even though video modeling is something that is really good for a skill deficit, it doesn't mean we don't mingle it in and work it into remediating performance deficits, because what you might do is you might still show the video, but then what you're going to need is you're going to make sure that they know how to apply that, whatever that skill is from that video, in those given settings. Because if it's a performance deficit, remember, there could be another reason besides just not knowing what to do, that they're not doing whatever the target behavior is. So if it's a performance deficit, what might end up happening is that your rehearsal schedule might not be as often. You might have more of an emphasis on using that target behavior and cueing strategies within that setting, or managing the environment, or setting up different environments where they actually get to apply the target behavior from the video. So you might not always be sure if it's skill or performance. If you're not sure, I would always assume that you have both a skill and performance deficit and hit it from both angles. So you might start off with a very aggressive rehearsal schedule and then kind of phase it out as you're getting that student to try to generalize the behavior. But you always want to be thinking of this, because if you forget to address it from both ways, or forget to link it up to the needs of that student, you might not be spending your time wisely, and you might not see as good of results. So those are your first two steps. Then obviously we need to make the video. You actually need the video itself. So yes, there might be some good pre-made videos out there that could appropriately address those target behaviors. I'm going to show you how to make a video, so you might actually have some videos on hand in a library somewhere where you can easily access them. But there's also value to making it customized for that student. And the reason is because the more specific you can make it, the more meaningful it's going to be and the more likely they're going to attend and apply it. So for example, if you're using their name in the video, or if you're using the names of other people who might be in the situation where they're struggling, that's going to just make it even more relevant. People respond better when things are customized, especially when they hear their name. Remember that these students that you're working with, they might not always realize that certain behaviors are relevant, and they might not always know when to attend to certain behaviors. So if you're saying their name throughout the video and it's really specific to their unique situation, it's going to be easier for them to draw the connections between, oh, this applies to me and I need to pay attention to this and do this behavior in this situation. So the more customized it is to that student, the better it's going to be and the better results that you're going to get. So item number 3 is a rehearsal schedule. So that is different from a practice schedule. So let me talk about what the rehearsal schedule is first. So the rehearsal schedule is how often you are going to have the student watch the video. I would start out in most cases, especially if you're pretty sure there's a skill deficit there, making sure that they at least watch it once a day, if not more. And obviously you're going to have to figure out logistics there with how they watch it. And we can talk about that later on as I'm going through tech, because you'll be able to see how you can give people access to this video. But you want to have that rehearsal schedule nailed down and figure out, when are we going to review it? When are we going to scale it back? And that sort of thing. But rehearsal, again, is just practice. It is an effective measure for students on the spectrum and with other social cognitive issues to just simply watch the video and rehearse. It's kind of like when you're studying for a test and you're reviewing your notes. So that is a research-based cognitive strategy that we know works for learning a new skill and for developing that cognitive knowledge of some specific type of content or information. Now, a practice schedule is a little different from the rehearsal schedule. While the rehearsal is just when you're reviewing the video and having them actually watch the video, you are also going to want to have a practice schedule. So while with rehearsal, you might just be having the student watch the video and maybe doing a quick discussion or debrief afterwards. With practice, you're actually going to create situations where the student is going to have to remember to use the target behavior. So you might create those situations on your own, like we're going to do a specific role play at this time, so it's a little more structured. Or you might give them times during the day, like during recess, we're going to practice this behavior. So it does require some scheduling and orchestrating. This is a perfect example of how, as SLPs, we want to be flexible in how we view our services. Sometimes having a conversation or a training with a staff member, with a parent, that is a service that you can provide. So your services, it doesn't mean that you need to always be sitting one-on-one or with a group with the student directly providing them therapy. Especially for this type of situation, it's just as valuable for you to be training other people how to utilize the strategy and how to cue the student to remember to use the behavior that they're learning in the video, because otherwise they're not going to generalize it. We've got to think about how we can take our knowledge and spread it to the other people that are working with that student. And as a result, that'll create more generalization. So you want to figure out that practice schedule. And again, I would aim for having at least one time a day that they're designated to practice it. At the beginning, if it's a skill deficit, it's okay to have a couple weeks of rehearsal. Maybe you only need 1 week. You might test it out to see if how they're doing to see if they're generalizing it. But after you've gone through the rehearsal and you know that they have developed the skill, or you at least have good reason to believe they've developed the skill and the knowledge, you want to start integrating practice in. So yes, at least doing it every day, at least every day that there's a school day is great. If you can only get it in a couple times a week at the beginning, that is okay. Eventually, you're going to get to the point where you might start out with other people needing to cue the student, but eventually you might get to the point where you can just send them off and say, okay, I want you to practice it at this time of day and come back and report how it went. So they might be a little bit more independent. And this is a perfect example of how we can utilize things like environmental setup and peer tutoring and things like that, which I'll be talking about in later videos. But a lot of these strategies work together in order for them to really work for the student. And then obviously number 6, you're going to want to make sure that you designate the responsible individuals for all of these things in your plan. And you might even have some type of a document where you discuss who's going to do what and when and who's going to report to who. Because if you don't do this, there's a lot of bystander effect going on, just saying like, oh, we're going to be better about cueing him to start conversations. That's really vague. That's a lot of work to put on a teacher or other staff member to just kind of remember it whenever. If you can be as specific as possible about the number of times, a lot of times that can increase the amount of buy-in you get and the amount of compliance you get. Because if you think about it, if you just say, be better about doing this behavior or be better about cueing them to do this behavior, they've got to make a lot of decisions about during the day about how many times do I do it? When do I do it? And so the more decisions you give someone to make, the easier it is for them to just get overwhelmed and make the decision to not do anything, because that's easier. But if you narrow it down and say, okay, let's decide to do this cue at this time, that makes it really specific about what they're supposed to do. And it takes the burden of having to make those decisions off of them. Obviously, you want to have a discussion with them so they don't feel like you're ordering them around. But if you can come to a consensus on that, make the decision up front, it's going to be a lot easier for people to follow through. And same goes with your student. Instead of saying, be better about doing this, be really specific, at least at the beginning, about when they should try to practice this skill. So as you can see, there is a lot more to video modeling than just a video. We do want to have a good video that's appropriate, that's aligned with their area of impairment and have an appropriate target behavior. But we want to make sure that we have the big picture, because I promise you, if you do all of this, and if you have a good rehearsal and practice schedule and you're consulting and getting that feedback, you are going to be way more effective than if you spend all your time trying to find the best video. Because number one, having a good practice schedule and having a good cueing system is better than having the perfect video. Because if you don't have that, you're not going to get that generalization. And if you don't give the student the opportunity to actually practice, you're not going to have that information to know, hey, this is where I might need to tweak my video, or maybe work on a different skill, or maybe consider like, hey, maybe it's more of a performance deficit now. You're going to get more information. Good intervention is diagnostic. So you want to get as much information as you can, but the only way you're going to continue getting that feedback is if you put your student out there into those situations.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all the resources that were mentioned in this episode. And be sure to check out the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers put executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams using multiple service delivery models. So I show you how to do direct intervention, and I also show you how to coach and train others so that you can ensure students get support across their day. Remember that it helps me so much if you tell your friends and colleagues about De Facto Leaders, And if you follow me and leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts, whether you listen on Apple or Spotify or another podcast network. And finally, if you're interested in collaborating with me, if you'd like to invite me to be on your podcast, if you would like to be a guest on De Facto Leaders, or if you have a suggestion for a guest for De Facto Leaders, please email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.